All right, students, I hope this is going to work okay. It's been a while since I made a YouTube video. But for all three classes yesterday, I think this is where we wound up. And I told you the most important invention in the entire Industrial Revolution was the steam engine, which was perfected by James Watt. Here's what one looks like. And very big machine. And remember what's going on here in the Industrial Revolution. It's making it possible for one person to get more work done. Okay? So that means they're going to be able to make a whole lot more stuff. And it's going to take people with a lot of money to set this stuff up. And it's going to enable them under capitalism that make a whole lot more money. But here's the thing about that. It's also going to make things cheaper. Okay? And it's going to provide a lot of jobs. They're not going to be really high paying jobs, but it will provide jobs. And so, so here's the thing. Now, I'm trying to give you the big picture here. So you'll hear people say, especially nowadays, that capitalism is evil. There is a lot of truth to that. It's really amoral, meaning it's not good or evil, it's both, or neither. The deal is, capitalism comes along, these people start making stuff. Now here's the thing. If everybody out there, like, we're going to take, I don't know, what's that place that I like, my wife doesn't like, Zaxby's, okay? She went one time, like 7 years ago, and hated it. And every time I say, let's try Zaxby's out, she doesn't like it. Well, I've liked it every time I've been there. As a matter of fact, I really like it. You can look at me and tell I don't miss many meals. Here's the thing. Zaxby's is an American corporation. Maybe their owner is filthy, stinking rich and has 100 Mercedes. Here's the thing. If he does not provide you a good meal at a reasonable price, people don't go there, correct? They don't go there. So if they don't go there, whoever the owner is loses all their money. So the deal is the capitalist, yes, can make lots and lots and lots of profits, but they have to make you happy at a price you can afford. If they don't, they go out of business. So they are kind of the good and the bad. But just looking at this machine, you can tell somebody who does not have a lot of money cannot afford to invest in this. All right, iron and steel. And I think most of my classes got through here. You're going to write all this down. Now remember, I'm assuming you guys are sitting in the auditorium. But you can pause this at any point and go back and copy your notes. Here's the key name you're going to need to know here. Bessemer. When we were kids, we used to drive my mom's parents were from Tennessee. And so every summer and every Christmas we went to Tennessee. Me and my brother loved it. And one of our favorite things was going through Birmingham, Alabama. Now, if you know anything about Birmingham, Alabama, there's a lot of steel factory. I don't know what they do around there. There's factories and steel and stuff like that. And there were days in Birmingham, when we drove through there, that they'd come on the radio and say, the pollution is so bad, do not go outside. So I don't know what it was. They were getting coal out of the ground. I'm not sure. But anyway, we would go to Tennessee, and as kids, we would go there all the time. We would memorize the road signs. And so we knew when we saw certain names on the sign that we were getting close to my grandparents' house in Columbia, Tennessee. And in northern Alabama somewhere, there's a town called Bessemer, Alabama. I never thought much about it. But this guy, the Bessemer, he's the one that came up with a system that makes steel cheaper. And so what happens is steel is very strong and it is not that heavy. If I was in the classroom, of course, the room I'm in now is not at the end of the hallway like the other one I used to be. But if you were at the end of the hallway, I would point at the corner of the room and I would say, you see that corner over there? Inside that concrete wall, there is steel rods. When they made my house, when they built the house I live in, I was actually here during a lot of it. The corners of my house has concrete blocks. Now, you know what some people call them cinder blocks. They've got concrete blocks with holes in the middle. What they would do is they would run steel rods down into these holes, and then they would pour liquid concrete. So the foundation of my house and the foundation of that building, the corners, the framework of the house, are concrete blocks, and inside them is steel rods with concrete. And I even here at home, I'm going to have trouble not going off on a tangent. On 9/11, if you remember when the World Trade Centers collapsed, I realize I don't think you were born when that happened, but you've seen the pictures. The guy who did that, Osama bin Laden, is an engineer from Saudi Arabia. He's a civil engineer, very smart. They took planes that were full of gasoline and crashed them into those buildings. What they wanted to do was have a really, really big explosion, which they got. And they wanted the heat from the fire, that resulting fire, to melt the steel in the corners of those buildings so that the top of the buildings would collapse. Now that happened. And he did not realize, bin Laden, and I'm not praising him, he's a bad guy, obviously, but he melted the corners of the steel in the corners of those buildings. And what happened was, what they wanted was the tops of the buildings to collapse in. That was their plan. What they didn't realize that it was going to bring the rest of the building down. And so I saw this big report on that. And then I remembered how they built my house. And I remembered this. So steel is a big deal. And it helps make buildings stronger. And Bessemer, this is a guy who does this. And it's a real big improvement. So there's a lot of names and inventions you're going to need to remember from this chapter. All right, transportation. Okay? All right, key thing. And you want to put an asterisk here. Okay, you know I'm going to give you a DBQ sometime soon. And they had a DBQ in my class about 2 years ago. And the entire DBQ was on railroads. The entire thing. So it is impossible for me to overstress how important railroads are. Okay? So you come in and you put rails down. And then you take the steam engine. Remember, the steam engine is the most important new invention. You put a steam engine in a railroad, in a what do you call the engine, the front engine, whatever you call it. I think you call it the engine car. I'll think of it here in a minute. The caboose is the end, but the locomotive, I guess, is what you call the front. You put a steam engine in there, and it can pull a train that's half a mile long. And so what happens is several things are going on. It can go quicker, right? Because the engine doesn't get tired like a horse will. It can go quicker, and if you ship things in that train, they're going to be cheaper. Things like carrots and celery, things that people eat. Plus, it can transport people. So railroads, the biggest, most significant invention of this time is the steam engine. Number 2 is probably the railroad. Pretty soon, we're going to be talking about the steamship. So you need to know why this is important. When they invent the railroad, let's say you can grow a crop that spoils, okay? That goes bad quickly. If you put it on a railroad, you can ship, I can think of it. You remember my story that I loaded watermelons. Watermelons stay good for several days. But the deal is there are a lot of products, food products, spoil within a couple of days. So if you can put them on a train, you can ship them a long distance. Shh. My assistant professor here is making noise. Hop up here. Hop up. Say hello to my students. Oh, he's a coward. Come here, Bo. Can you see Bo? He's not too happy to get in the picture here. He's a very happy dog, but he doesn't, I guess. This is Beauregard. His real name is Bogart, but I call him Bogart, Beauregard, Bocephus, Bojangles, anything else too. All right, so railroads, 1815. By the way, this was the end of the Napoleonic Wars. You know, I haven't been making you memorize dates, but there's a good date for you to memorize. At least now when you memorize a date, you can tell your friends you've got a date. All right, moving on here. All right, kind of interesting here. The first famous railroad locomotive was called the Rocket. As I recall, last year's textbook said the top speed was 16 miles an hour. I don't believe it was 28, but you can go ahead and write this down. And that is very slow, obviously, but just imagine, before people had to ride horses and bounce up and down or ride in a wagon, now you can ride in a locomotive and you can go 200 miles and you don't need to stop. You don't need to change your horse. You can just sit there and let the wind blow through your hair. I realize somebody wants to make a joke. Now is not a good time. Steamships, I told you it was coming. So these are all technological improvements that happen because of the steam engine. Okay, and the same thing I told you about food applies to steamships as well. You can take food further places. Now remember, capitalism is doing all of this. These are people trying to make money. They're rich business people. And like, again, you'll hear people say now, they're evil, they're horrible people. The planet would be better off without them. But they're feeding tons of people. They're getting food and supplies all around the world, and they're feeding people. And both these things, railroad and steamships, are going to be important later on, especially when we get to World War I. Because what's going to happen with these trains and these steamships is they're going to move soldiers and weapons around. All right, so anyway, what happens is eventually you have dense transportation networks. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Chicago. It used to be the #1 city in the United States was New York, or the largest, and Chicago was #2 and LA was #3. Now, the #1 city population-wise is New York. LA, Los Angeles is #2, and Chicago is #3. And I want to go to Chicago. I've been to the other couple places. I'm glad to be from Florida. LA's okay. I would rather live here. New York, been there, done that. I'm a Florida boy. I'll stay here. But Chicago, I've never been to. But if you study the history books, and next year you're going to learn this in APUSH, AP U.S. History, Chicago, which is kind of centrally located on the eastern half of the United States, if you looked at it, there was railroad lines everywhere around there. And so if you killed a bunch of cows in Missouri and butchered them and put the beef, or killed pigs and put the sausage and the bacon on that train, you could ship it into Chicago. And so it would come in from Missouri into Chicago, get on another train, and head to Alabama, Virginia, South Carolina. So Chicago was famous for a railroad hub. And so here's the big deal. By the way, you want to asterisk this too. One way to measure how industrialized the country is how many miles of railroad it had. And you guys live in one of the country that's eventually going to have the most miles of railroad line of any of them, the United States of America. So you're probably going to see eventually a stimulus question where it shows a bunch of countries, and it'll say the name of the country, the population, and you're going to look at the number of miles of railroad line. And that is an indication of how industrialized that country is. Okay, and you can go ahead and write this. It encouraged industrialization. So they're building factories. And what do you do in your factories? You bring people in by train. You bring raw materials in by train and by steamship. Then you make something, and what have you got to do then? You got to ship it back out. So you might bring cotton from India into London. What are you going to do in London? You're going to make clothes. You're going to put them on a steamship. So you're going to bring in cotton from, where did I say, India, in on a steamship, comes into London. You put it on a train that takes the raw cotton up to Manchester, England. They turn that into clothing. They ship that back down by road back to London, put it on another steamship, and they send it to, let's say, Brazil, where the people can get inexpensive clothes. I tried to do this one year in class. It didn't work very well. And don't try this in the auditorium or wherever you are. But if you could look at the tag on the back of your clothing, your shirt, you're going to find out it's almost assuredly not made in the United States. First off, you probably got it very, very cheaply, and it was probably not made by here. And that is a gift of industrialization. All right, this is the rocket, the first railroad locomotive. Okay, the factory system, very important. I'm looking at the clock here. We're moving up on 15 minutes. And so I want you to go ahead and write all this stuff down here. And you can pause the video. But I'm going to talk about this. I do not remember if I have talked about the putting out system or not. Okay. So anyway, underline the putting out system. Now remember, I'm probably going to give you SAQs this week. I was going to give you an LEQ, but now that I've thought about it, I'm going to have so many invention names, so many names. I can just give you a picture and I can say, give me 2 facts about this. That's how SAQs work. But I want you to underline this thing, putting out. Okay, and if I have not explained it, I'm about to explain it. By the way, I'm watching the clock down here. If this thing, we're at 14 minutes. If this thing stops at 15, I paid the money to update my membership to this plan that records. And so it may stop at 15 or it may not. If it does, I'll go to video number 2. All right, so anyway, let me tell you what the putting out system was. Some guy owns a factory where he makes clothing. And I don't remember the situation. I believe they bring in cotton and they spin it into thread, I believe. And then they weave that into cotton cloth, which he makes clothes out of. And if that's out of order, it doesn't really matter. You don't really need to know that in an AP World History Survey class. But what they do is they make cotton cloth. So here's what they do. They take the cotton, they bring it into the factory. Here's what the factory owner does. he puts it on a wagon and he sends it way out in the countryside where there are women sitting at home. Okay, I do believe I've talked about this. Now, you really want to be paying attention here. These women at home probably have 4 or 5 kids. So they cannot go get a job in the city because they've got to watch 5 kids. And whoever they're going to have to pay to watch your kids is going to cost too much money. So so they're sitting there at home, and this factory owner comes up with this idea. Look, I'm going to make numbers up here. Let's say he paid his factory workers $2 a day. And let's say that was a lot of money back then. Here's what he does. Instead of paying these women $2 a day, he's going to pay them approximately $1 a day. So he's getting them half price. And I know what you're going to say. He's taking advantage of them. Well, he is and he isn't. He is in that he's paying them half what he's paying the rest of his other workers. But he isn't, because they don't live in the city where it's more expensive. They live in the country where it's cheaper. And they get to make $1 a day while they're watching their kids. Okay? So it's kind of, I won't say it's a win-win, but it's a win-lose. You know, it's good on some hand and the other. That is called the putting out system. Now stay with me. So Sunday night, he takes his wagon out and gives them the cotton. He says, I'll be back in 1 week. He's taken his product and he's putting it out. That's where the term comes from, them to work on. He's putting it out. They work on it. He comes back the next week. They give him the thread and he takes it back to his weavers. Okay? And so you can see right here, individuals worked at home. The employers avoided the wage restrictions. They didn't have to pay as much money. Again, I don't remember if I've told you this before, but my wife used to be a legal secretary. And when our kids were small, we didn't want to pay for a babysitter. When my kids were small, we finally put them in kinder care, or we like to call baby jail. And my kinder care bill was, I want to say, $800 a month. And so it's very expensive to have a really good daycare, really good baby jail. So if you can stay at home and take care of your own kids and make a little money, that's a good deal. So my wife's lawyer that she used to work for, he would record tapes. I do believe I've told you the story, on a dictation machine. And they would take the tapes to our house, somebody who worked there, give them to my wife. And she would spend, I would come in from my jobs and go to bed, and she would stay up till like 1 o'clock in the morning typing this stuff. The next morning, the lady from her office would come by and pick up the documents my wife had typed. So they were paying my wife cheaper than they would have paid her if she worked in the legal office. But she's doing a good job, and she gets to keep her own kids, save that $800 a month, and make a little bit of money. So it was kind of, for us, a win-win. All right, so eventually, as you see down here, as the Industrial Revolution progressed, they started replacing both the guilds. Remember, that's something like a union, and the putting out system. And here's the reasons why. Now, make sure you're writing this down. The machines were too large to keep in people's houses. And it was too expensive. You don't want to take a $50,000 machine and put it in somebody's house, because the house could burn down. And eventually, in the factories, they would build larger buildings, and you could put specialized laborers there. And urbanization, now that's a word you want to underline right there. Urbanization is moving from the country to the city. A lot of you, again, I'm watching the clock here because I have to go to water polo practice tonight. A lot of you, as soon as you graduate from Apopka High, you want to get out. If I was in class, I would say, how many of you want to leave Apopka? And I promise you, 2/3 of the kids would raise their hand. I asked the kid one year, I said, where do you want to go? He goes, I don't know, anywhere but here. And I said, why do you want to leave? He goes, Apopka sucks. But anyway, a lot of you want to go to the big city, Orlando, New York, to get a job. These people are doing the same thing, except they're leaving the country and they're going to the city. And guess where they're going to wind up working? They're going to wind up working in the factories. And so you make sure you understand the connection. We're also going to talk about very soon the so-called agricultural revolution. Used to be it took a lot of people to work the fields. But they're not only inventing new machines for factories, they're building new machines for farmers, things like tractors and things like that. So the farmers, they need less people to grow the food, which means the people in the country don't have jobs anymore, so they move to the city. All right, working conditions and industrial protest. So here's the thing. When you work out in the country, now again, I said this in a couple of my classes, a lot of people have this idea that working as a farmer is just wonderful. And I know some farmers who really like it. I wish I could grow, man. Anything I plant, you know what the saying is, if you can grow stuff, you have a green thumb. If you kill everything you plant, you got a brown thumb. That's me. It's like dropping a nuclear bomb right in the middle of everything. So the deal is, it's not easy to be a farmer, but some people think, wow, it would be great. So what happens is when you're a farmer, you get to kind of work your own rhythm. Now, as I told one of my classes, we have chickens in our backyard. And in the last 2 weeks, the rooster has finally learned how to crow. But back in the country where my cousins lived, the rooster would wake them up at like 5 o'clock in the morning. They'd get out of bed, and I don't know what it is about milking cows. They would milk the cow in the morning and get the eggs. They did all this. So they'd be out working at like 5 or 6 o'clock. By 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, a lot of them would take a break. They'd come in and take a nap, sit around, eat breakfast. And they had their own rhythm. You know what I mean? If you needed to take a day off, you took a day off, okay? Once you're working in a factory, it's like being in school. And I did not compare factory work to school. So do not quote me on that. But you got to be in school on a certain time or you're tardy. And so this is an important thing for you to understand. It changed the work rhythms. People in the country don't have alarm clocks. The sun coming through the window wakes them up. The rooster crowing wakes them up. When you have to be at work at a certain time, you have to have a clock. You guys use your watches, I'm sure, or your cell phones. Every day I use Alexa, my Kindle, and my cell phone. So I have 3 alarms go off every day to make sure I get up. Okay, so 6 days a week, this is what happens in the factories. You work 14 hours a day. You have people right there over you. In the farm, you know, if you were working for your dad or your uncle, Dad would say, go plow that back 40 acres. And he might ride out on his horse a few hours later. He can see if you did what you're supposed to do or not. And if you're working for your family, there's a good chance you're not screwing around. In the factory, you have a boss there who's not a member of your family, and they punish people right there. As a matter of fact, we're going to learn about child labor. Frequently, the kids were beaten. Sometimes the supervisors would have I don't know necessarily a whip, but they would have a cane, and they would go around and they would beat the kids and the adults that did not work. So it's kind of harsh. And I don't know that I made this speech in all 3 classes, but most of you apparently don't have any opinion on the Industrial Revolution. But I can tell you, most people have a very, very negative connotation because all the things I'm saying. You go from the country to the city. You go from your own schedule to the city schedule. But I can tell you there were some good things. Products are better made now. They're cheaper. And I'm going to be honest with you. A lot of people, as bad as they paid the people in the factories, a lot of people in the factories had more spending money and time than they did at home. Here's another thing. I'm sure you guys are all too young to be interested in a significant other, a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Some of you probably want one of each. I don't know what Generation Z does, and I don't want to know. But the thing is, if you're going to meet your significant other or others, as the case may be, there's a lot more in the city. And so a lot of kids on the farm wanted to get away from their parents' constant supervision, and that happened. So I think you can see now why it would be very easy for me to give you an LEQ on the Industrial Revolution. That is like the easiest thing. You could just rack up the points because you got all sorts of changes. You got all sorts of new inventions, and you got some good things about moving to the cities and some bad things. Moving on. Okay, so you want to asterisk this. This is very important. So there was I believe he was a fictional character named Ludd. I don't know if he was a real guy or not. But in 1811 to 1816, here's what happened. Most of this involves England, by the way. People in, say, England, they decided that the government, they decided that these machines were taking their jobs away, right? So they're like, wow, I used to have a good job in the factory, but now the boss bought a machine that takes my job. So what these guys would do is they would sneak in the factory after dark and they would smash the machines. Make sure you understand this. Remember, you're taking this class not just to pass an AP exam, you're taking it to be intelligent. And they call the nickname amongst educated people for people that are not good with technology is Luddite. By the way, before I started recording this, I did a Zoom conference with my brother in Alaska. My brother is a multimillionaire. He has a degree in engineering, and he's a retired fighter pilot. He was a fighter pilot in the Air Force, and he's a retired Delta airline pilot. Smartest person in my family. And I'm trying to teach him, the genius, how to do a Zoom conference. And it was kind of a joke. He's like, yeah, you'd think some of the degree in engineering would be good. What I could have called him was a Luddite. Okay? A Luddite is a modern day nickname for someone who doesn't like technology. What it meant back then was these people that were going in and smashing machines. I made a joke with my kids one year, because my laptop's always slowing down in class. It'd be like if I sneaked in my classroom at night and brought in a sledgehammer and smashed my computer. Here's the thing. If I did that, would that make my work easier or harder? It'd be stupid. It'd make it harder. So make sure you know what the Luddites were. They existed for all these years. Eventually, whichever government, I'm pretty sure this is England, got upset at these people for doing this and executed, I think the book says 8 people, and the rest of the Luddites decided they were going to knock it off. And here you go. They would go in with masks on, and the people liked it. When you get in American history next year, you're going to learn about one of the most famous bank robbers of all time, and his name was Jesse James. Jesse James and his brother Frank, they liked to rob trains. And here's what's interesting about this. They would rob a train and they would go through. Now, they were killers is what they were, but they were romanticized. They would go down the train, point their guns at people, and they'd say, ma'am, take off your earrings, your jewelry, give us all your cash. But there's this famous story that there was a guy there, an old guy, and he was all kind of stooped and everything. And Jesse James says, show me your hands. Well, when he showed him his hands, there were calluses on there. And he goes, you get to keep your money. You're a working man. And so Jesse and Frank James were a bunch of murderous, robbing thugs is what they were. But what happened was they robbed the railroads. And the people in Missouri where these live, this is an American story, obviously, they hated the trains, the railroad companies, because they would come in and buy all your land, take it away from you, and build a railroad through there. And so they became heroes to the common people. And the same thing happened with the Luddites. They're going around smashing equipment, but a lot of people thought they were heroes. But, again, a bunch of them got killed, and they got over it. 14 Luddites. All right, I was off. Okay, now remember, this is the most famous drawing of the Luddites. Be prepared for a SAQ. Okay, so here's what they would do with the SAQ. They would put this up and they would say, list one factor that contributed to this situation. And you got to write it in sentences. This is an SAQ, short answer question. So you would say, one factor that led to this was the rapid industrialization and the rich capitalists buying machinery that took away people's jobs. You'd have to explain what this is. Or it could say, which process is happening in this picture? Well, it's industrialization. Then they would say, so there'd be like 3 questions. They'd say, list the process that's happened in this factory. And you'd say, this is industrialization. The second question would be, list one positive effect. Well, people had cheaper goods. List one negative effect. The people working in the factories had harsh working conditions. There was environmental damage. All sorts of different things. Well, heck, this was supposed to drop down, stop. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and let you write this, okay? Write all this down. So the Industrial Revolution begins in England, correct? Then it spreads. It starts there, and it spreads to France, Germany, Belgium, and the United States. And what happened was when the Napoleonic Wars were going on, I didn't do a big deal with AP World. All I told you was Napoleon went to war with half the world. He fought with France, Prussia, Austria, the Russians, the English. Well, he didn't fight with France. He ran France. France fought everybody else. And so what happened was during the war, there was all sorts of trade barriers set up. But after the war, the Industrial Revolution spread to Europe. England was out on an island. Napoleon never got to them. And so England had their factories going. France and Germany didn't have any of that stuff going on until after the Napoleonic Wars. Skip all the way down and see that name Bismarck. Make sure you remember this. Bismarck was the genius that put Germany into a country. We talked about that last week. And he ran the German government. And remember when I talked about my former regular American history students, doing a personal inventory, and I said, talk about your parents. And the analogy about your parents was like the government. The German government was very, very pro-business. By the way, I don't want to get controversial here, but I may as well. One of the biggest differences between the Democrats and the Republicans in this country is their emphasis on business. And one of the parties is much more open about, now again, I'm being controversial, and I'm not there to answer any questions. Both parties will tell you they're supporting business. But I'm sure most of you know that one has a reputation of being more pro-business, and the other one is saying, yeah, but we need to be pro-worker too. And so that shows the government, and so a lot of people are watching the stock market now because of this change in the presidency. We're going from a Republican president to a Democrat president. How is that going to affect all this? All right, so anyway, make sure you know Bismarck is the German government. Okay, and this is the map, again, of how industrialization is spreading. You can't see it in my PowerPoint, but I'm assuming that there's a picture of this in your book. All right, North America. Okay, and I'm going to click all the way down here. I'm about to run out of time here. I have to go to water polo practice. So how did the Industrial Revolution affect America? It came to New England first. Okay, let me tell you what New England is. New England is Massachusetts, Rhode Island, let me see, Delaware. Delaware is not really New England. I'm having a senior moment. The two states that are next to each other, New Hampshire and Vermont, Maine, Rhode Island, Connecticut, that's the New England states. The cotton, notice it's the textiles, it's clothing. This is a textile. The textile industry moved into England, and then they eventually put heavy iron and steel industries in Pennsylvania and Alabama. And by 1900, within 30 years, the United States was maybe at the end of World War I and World War II, the United States is going to become the most powerful country in the world. The Chinese are going to take a detour come the 1940s into socialism, and they're going to wind up starving and killing 20 million of their people. The Russians are going to take a detour into socialism, and they're going to kill 10 million of their own people. Then they're going to lose like 20 million more in World War II. Now, notice what's going on in the United States is just exploding, exploding with profits and job growth. And notice the last thing, the industry was stimulated by railroad construction. So here railroads tie into American history. I got about 1 minute. Anyway, I just want to tell you a story here. When we were kids, I told you that we used to go through Birmingham. You already saw me click, and you can see what's on the next slide. And when you're a little kid, we always wanted to go see our grandparents. The interstate now, I think, goes through Birmingham, Alabama. Before, we took these minor roads there. And when we were kids now, I'm talking like 1971, when I was in like 5th grade. We would go to sleep in the car, and my mom would be driving, and she goes, there's a statue of Vulcan. And Vulcan is the god, I don't know if that's a Greek or Roman god name. Remember they had different names. Vulcan was the god of the forge, or the god of fire. And so, because there's all these steel mills around Birmingham, remember I told you the pollution was bad, Mom would say, wake up and see Vulcan. And at the time, Vulcan, we would drive right under this statue, and we thought it was cool. So I Googled it and looked it up to put it in this lecture just so I would have a story to tell. And dang it, it's kind of an ugly looking statue, but when you're a kid, you're impressed with it. And then about 10 years later, they moved the interstate. And so we drove through Birmingham. Birmingham is like a valley. You go over these hills, and there's this huge valley, and there's city as far as you can see. And it's ugly too. It's not a pretty place. And we would have to look all over town to spot this statue. So I threw a picture in here. And when we were kids, we sure thought that was pretty. And he was standing up over the road. And they built that there to basically symbolize the steel industry. And at this point, I'm going to stop. I'm probably going to do a second video when I get home from water polo practice tonight. All right, so I'm going to